those of you that don't know me, I'm Lieutenant Hilscher from the Sheriff's Office, and I'm the liaison to Columbia County Emergency Management. And in conjunction with the Fire Coordinator's Office, we're hosting this class, and I'd like to introduce Nadine. She's the Region 2 Coordinator for State Emergency Management at Poughkeepsie. So she's our representative for the state, okay? So, all right.
Any questions for Bill?
I know probably about 80% of everybody in here, so I don't know.
Awesome.
Don't tell anything about it.
Oh, Mr. Beck, don't worry.
What's the word, yeah.
We also know you, Bill.
I know that, I know, it's a two-way street there, gee.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to attend. Right now, we have 2 registration sheets going around. I am very sorry. I know a lot of you guys had challenges registering. So we have one that, a couple people made it through the challenges, but most people have to fill out the full registration. So it's not a big deal. And we have people from my state OEM headquarters that are going to put you into the system, so you will get credit for this class. So thank you. So first of all, I want to emphasize that there are chocolate cookies over there with the M&Ms, my bribery. I start off first thing because, I want to have a good evaluation form. There are evaluation forms in the paperwork.
Do we have to share?
Share the cookies?
Do I have to share the cookies?
There's plenty in there. But if you want to eat them all yourself, that's okay. Just sneak them out.
No, I want to get out of here alive. I wouldn't do that.
I just feel like if you're going to give up a couple hours of your time on a Thursday evening after 6:30, that you need some homemade cookies. So that's my feeling. You're welcome. So tonight we're going to talk about NIMS overview for senior officials. We're going to start off with the course introduction. This is 7 modules. Module 3 is the longest and the most challenging, so we'll just leave it at that. So we're going to start with module number 1, unit objectives. We're going to talk about what the course goals and objectives are for this, basically. And first we'll start off with introductions. Name, job title and jurisdiction, and course expectations. And I want you guys to think about it. Write down, take a minute on a piece of paper and write down what your course expectations. This course is like giving you some familiarity with other courses. We're not going to bring you out to become an expert in NIMS or ICS or anything. We're just giving you an overview. So we'll start over here. Tom, why don't you start us off?
Hello everybody, I'm Tom Matei. I work for New York State OEM Training Exercise Section. Been there almost 4 years now. Work at Albany. In terms of course expectations, quick backstory, I recently got promoted, so I am learning, it's been my new job assignment, so I'm actually learning what the course is fully about, and that's it. Thank you.
I don't have to stand, I'm shy. Hi, I'm Jessica Zamler. I just started in the training and exercise section at OEM. Before that was in the watch center. I'm brand new to training, so this whole experience is a learning curve for me.
Excellent. You want to go next?
Sure, so I'm Melanie Spock and I'm a trustee for the Village of Chatham. Also, I work in Albany at the New York State Health Facilities Association, where I am the emergency preparedness coordinator. So I've taken incident command, a couple of courses like that. So I just thought it would be good to see how it relates to my role on the village board.
Excellent. Good thinking. Mark.
Mark Van Vorst, Columbia County Emergency Management. Been doing it for 3-4 years, something like that. In my previous life, I was emergency management for the Thruway Authority. And I've had, 100 to 400 and all the other ones. Just it was many years ago, so I'm going to brush up a little bit, see what's new.
Sounds good to me. Boy.
Roy Brown, I worked part-time for the Columbia County Emergency Management Office. As a public official at one time, and fairly heavily involved with the Emergency Management Office. And like Mark said, I'd take 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, whatever, and get a brush up. It's been a while since I've taken any of these classes.
Excellent.
Neil Howard, the Superintendent of County Hill Central School District, and I just want the district to be prepared.
Absolutely. That's a big undertaking. IT.
Yep, I'm Oswaldo Rosette. I work for Columbia County MIS. Yeah, it's my first time here. Hi folks, Drew Ledoux. I'm the Dean of Students at Columbia Green Community College, and I am looking to become more familiar with emergency response and working with my colleagues, John and Maria, and responding to situations as they might arise on campus.
Hello, everybody. My name's John Leone. I'm here tonight with wearing two hats. I'm representing the town of Stockport as a town councilman, as well as I'm director of security for Columbia Green Community College. So I'm helping out in both places.
So,
Hi, I'm Maria Ostrander. I am here under two roles as well. I'm one of the deputy EMS coordinators for Columbia County, and I'm also the new director of health services for Columbia Green Community College. So I'm here to refresh myself on the ICS system.
excellent. I'm Melissa Negley, I'm the town clerk in Stuyvesant. And we're just starting to really focus on our emergency management plans. So I'm here to learn what I have to do.
Absolutely.
Bill Vick, town of Stuyvesant, also emergency management for the town. And just be prepared if something happens.
Excellent.
I'm Ron Knott, I'm town supervisor of the town of Stuyvesant, I'm also deputy chairman of the board of supervisors in Columbia County.
Excellent. Dual roles for a lot of people.
George Keeler, Columbia County Fire Coordinator, and I've sat through numerous iterations of ICS, and I'm really here for cookies.
Other than what I've said, I reiterate what Mark and Mr. Brown said, I'm just here to freshen up on some things, and I have a little note from Henry, who's out there in virtual land. He says, I can't get it to work, meaning watch, it says it's in restricted mode. So for IT.
He's trying to get on YouTube.
He's trying to get on, watch it on YouTube, so I don't, he's my man that's gonna say whether it's live streaming correctly or not, and I'll give input, so.
Well, that's good that we know that now because we're just in introduction. So
Yeah.
hopefully by the time we actually get to you.
Yep, so,
Good to know.
okay.
Jamie Bone, trustee for the Village of Chatham as well, and I am here because last year we got thrown into an emergency situation with our water main break, and I want to be a little more prepared than I was the last time.
I'm Donna Ring, and I work for the supervisor for the town of Livingston, and just want to become more familiar with management protocols.
James Dudley, town of Livingston supervisor, and deputy chair of the board of supervisors.
Excellent. Well, like I said, thank you all for taking the time to come to this class. It's gonna be a very interactive class. I'm gonna ask a bunch of questions in between. So hopefully, and if no one answers, I'm just gonna say, okay, Bill, what do you think? Or why? Basically, at the end of this, we're gonna talk about the National Incident Management System. We're gonna talk about ICS, EOCs, MAC groups, and That's an important first step, because everything starts and ends local. Anyone here ever heard of home rule? Many people have heard of home rule. It's up to the local governments. And I always stress, because get to know the neighboring towns and villages, because they can help you out also. Have that communication and coordination during emergencies. Because they're really, and during an emergency or disaster, if you need something, we always suggest go local first, then go to the county. We have two people here from County Office of Emergency Management. Go to them, ask them. And then if the county cannot help you out, then it goes to the state. And if the state can't help you out, it goes to the federal government. There are kind of exceptions to this, because sometimes it's very specific. Does anyone here remember the landslide that happened right next to the sheriff's office? A lot of you heard about that? Well, the county doesn't have and the state doesn't have, but the Army Corps of Engineers has specialists. So they came out and helped out for a couple of days. And they're awesome, because that's all they do. Stuff like that. Work on incidents like that. So that's why sometimes, it's a smaller incident, but it's an important one. And Bill, you were shaking your head. They did a pretty good job for you guys. They did. They did an awesome job. It wasn't a federally declared disaster. It wasn't anything major, but they came out and were able to help out. And that's why these partnerships are important. NIMS provides a consistent nationwide approach. They want to make sure, that's why the National Incident Management System, they want to make sure it's the same thing in New York, Texas, everywhere. Because if you get sent to another state or you want to volunteer to help out in another state, that's why everyone actually works together and has the same communication, the same information. And basically it allows, like I mentioned on the last slide, you want to be able to have the federal government, the state government, the local government, whether it's county, town, or village, helping, working together, as well as with organizations, local businesses. Local businesses sometimes have a lot of resources that we don't know about, as well as the non-governmental organizations. How does this happen? Basically, all this works together to prevent before an emergency or disaster happens, during a response when the actual incident is occurring, and recovery, which sometimes can be, if you have a blizzard coming in, it's great. You go out there for a day or 2 or 3 maximum, you get rid of the snow, you move it out, and then it's gone. Everyone here remember the ice storm, what was that, 10 years ago now? 10, 12 years ago? That took like 12 to 16 months for all the different debris to be removed. So even though that wasn't a federally declared disaster, what was it, 96% of the roads were impassable at some point at least? That's huge. So when you're thinking about response and then mitigation, basically cause. It doesn't matter what causes it, whether it's a human cause or a natural cause, whatever the cause is. Size. You could have a simple one building structure fire that could be used for the National Incident Management System. Or you could have something, for example, size, the California wildfires are managed using the National Incident Management System. And anywhere in between. Location, it could be one building in the middle of a small town, which happens to be right next to the school and has hazardous materials in it. So it can grow in complexity. So all of a sudden you have one building on fire, but now you have all these different people that have to come in and help out because of its location and different other problems that can be associated. And like I mentioned earlier, basically we're all here to reduce the loss of life, property, and harm to the environment. NIMS is comprehensive because they want all different types of hazards. So whatever hazard you could think of, they want it that way. They want it nationwide, and it's a system. It's not a plan, it's a system to bring people together. It's a set of concepts for all threats, hazards, and events that could happen. For example, the Super Bowl. Do you know how much planning goes into the Super Bowl? Wherever it is, there's a lot of emergency management that happens behind the scene of that. And that's something that happens nationwide. We mentioned scalable, flexible, and adaptable. NIMS is, it's not just simply a large event or incident. It could be any type and size. Something about resources. resources, when I look at resources and think about resources, I think about personnel, because you always need personnel, you need staff. And then you need equipment, so you might need a fire truck, you might need a DOT vehicle. And then you need supplies. So anything to, you know, you use your DOT vehicle, but you might need supplies to go with it, a chainsaw, because you had a tornado go through. Something like that. And facilities. This is a great facility to have training and various other things if needed. So when you're thinking about resources, think about all of those. And like when you're talking about the town and village, what resources do you have as far as personnel, supplies, equipment, facilities that you can use during a disaster or emergency? Now, we all know communication is the most difficult part of any emergency or disaster. Everyone here remembers Hurricane Irene? When communication was completely gone in parts of Greene County. We didn't even know for the first 24 to 48 hours how bad it was in certain locations. So communication, I always suggest, you know, we have different radios, we have satellite phones, we have everything, but if worse comes to worse, use a runner and a piece of paper. What's going on, or some type of information. That never seems to fail. NIMS components, these are the things we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the Incident Command System, which is Module 3, Emergency Operations Center, multi-agency coordination groups, and joint information systems. Command. Who has the explicit authority for the management of all incident operations? Now remember, this is starts and ends locally. So who would actually have command? For example, the structure fire we were talking about, who has command of that? Fire chief. Accident on the roadway, who's in charge of that?
Police agency.
Police agency. But they work very closely with fire department and EMS because they don't do that as well. But, you know, it would start off with police. Who's in charge of medical calls? For example, a heart attack in a governmental building. EMS. Absolutely. So when you're thinking about explicit who's in charge, you know, especially for local events and incidents, it's gonna be the town mayor, town supervisor is going to be in charge until they ask for help or until they give power of attorney to someone else. Multi-agency coordination, there's a whole module on this, so it's basically all levels of government and all other organizations working together to, and this is what I like on this one, to work together more efficiently and effectively. There's nothing that's perfect. You know, we all find that, okay, well, you didn't do this or you didn't do that. The goal is to work as well together as possible. Multi-agency coordination group, it's developing policies. One of the hardest parts too is if you have a tornado that goes through a town and village, you might not have all the resources and personnel you need. So you have to figure out how to allocate it. Sometimes it's by calling in mutual aid, but you really need to have an idea of how bad it is in which locations so that you can develop based on just where the worst hit areas is and work from there. Or sometimes you can't get there as quickly as possible. So it's just knowing the situation and being able to allocate what resources you have, get in what resources you need, and develop priorities. Emergency operations centers. How many local jurisdictions? The county has an emergency operations center. The state has one in Albany. It's building 22. It's kind of in a bunker. The two of them work very close to the emergency operations center. Right in well, not really downtown Albany, but it's a bunker. It's under the state police building. There are windows, but they just lead to other classrooms and stuff like that. So they don't really have windows. Do the local towns and villages, do you guys have emergency operations centers?
We can make one.
We're setting one up now
Okay.
in the town hall, in the process of.
Sometimes the best way to do it, you know, I've been here 18 years, so I've been to emergency operations centers. I've been in one in the town of Deer Park in Orange County. The first 18 months that I worked for New York State, they had 4 federally declared disasters for flooding in the town of Deer Park in Orange County. 4 in 18 months. So I spent a lot of time in that town and village area. And they basically had a big room like this, put some tables together so that they all looked at each other and talked to each other, brought in some phone lines, and that's what they used as their emergency operations center. And it worked. So, and sometimes, especially like if you're listening to National Weather Service conference calls, or if the county's gonna do a conference call with all the towns and villages, which quite often happens, just to get a situational assessment, it's just getting everyone into the same room. It doesn't have to be this glamorous one. New York City has a huge one, which I think this is a lot bigger than New York State's. New York State has a decent sized emergency operations center, but now it's more into breakout rooms as well. So it's a little bit different in the way it's operating. But, you know, all the different towns, all the different counties have different sizes. Orange County has a huge emergency operations center in their new building. So there are, you know, some of them, you know, you can see the pictures are very big. Joint information systems. We all know that the public needs information sometimes, especially during a hazardous material incident. We all know that sometimes you have to evacuate people. Sometimes you have to tell people to shelter in place. So it's really important dealing with joint information system and getting the public to know what's going on, as well as avoiding rumors. Has anyone ever saw on Facebook or Twitter or something, rumors, and you laugh and you're like, there's no way that's true? I like telling people on Facebook, you mean that's not true? Oh my goodness, I would never have guessed that. You know, if it's on the internet, it's gotta be true, right? Exactly, Mark understands me. So sometimes it's inaccurate information. Incident command system. Has everyone here taken some incident command system classes? Couple of classes here or there, most have. We're gonna still go through a bunch of it, so but we'll hold off for the module. It's basically an on-the-scene incident management system. So it's where your structure fire is, it's where your hazardous material is. It's actually bringing people together at the actual scene of whatever the incident is, whether it's flooding or anything that could happen, the active shooter. This is one of the great slides because it's really confusing. It can be confusing. On-scene multi-agency coordination, incident command, unified command, that's actually boots on the ground, dealing with objectives, figuring out how to save lives. And that's the priority. Remember, we're saving lives, we're protecting property as much as possible, and trying to make sure that the environment is protected as well. The incident command or unified command with a liaison officer can talk to whoever else they want to. Quite often, they will go back to dispatch centers. They're gonna go back to the 911 dispatch center and ask for more resources or ask for information. Or they could ask for a technical specialist. So they could ask for someone who, you know, say it's something that happens at the college. They could ask for someone from the college to come to the incident command post because they want someone there who's a technical specialist. MAC groups, this is how they all kind of communicate, jurisdictional EOCs, departmental operations centers. So for example, in New York State, emergency management has a emergency operations center. But each of the other organizations, for example, the fire guys, they have a fire operations center. It's the FOP. DOT has their own facility that works on emergencies. It's called the STIC. Please do not ask me what that acronym is, because I honestly don't know. But what I'm saying is that there's also department operations centers as well. Overview of senior officials' role. This is kind of scary. It's interesting because it says safety of the citizens and protection of property as much as possible. But I also like to stress on this, there's visitors. How many times do people have visitors at their houses or in town or at restaurants? So remember, yeah, there are visitors that come into towns, villages, and Columbia County, especially the Catamount ski area right on the other side. Continuity of government. How'd you guys do with COVID? Were you guys able to continue all your town and villages, policies, procedures, meetings and everything, even though COVID happened? Did anyone feel the need to have like a continuity of government plan? Or did it just kind of work together and everyone was able to figure out what to do? Okay, that's important. Especially, you know, one of the things that I found out for, you know, like the court system. The court system has to keep going on because you actually have to get cases done. And so, for example, during Hurricane Irene, the courthouse in Columbia County got damaged or destroyed. Let's just say it was destroyed. So they had to find a new location, and they had to take all their files and everything with them. And they had to find a safe place because, you know, courthouses, you sometimes have people in different areas that need to be locked up. So it was a very big challenge for them. Activating specific legal authorities. Has anyone in here ever declared a state of emergency for like the town or village? You guys have declared a state of emergency and you've done local emergency orders to go with it? Excellent. So that's an important part of it. Because sometimes you may end up having to shut down a road or shut down an area. Delegating authority for the incident command to the incident command post. You know, when it's very simple when there's a fire because the fire chief is in charge. But sometimes when there's flooding or different types of emergency the tornado goes through, you kind of have to work together to make sure that that's completed. PIO, the media. The sad part, there's a good part and a bad part. New York City's only a couple hours away. So the New York City press, when they're bored and have nothing to do, they could actually make it to Columbia County. So that's a positive / negative. Does everyone remember the incident at the Pine Plains School? That was a slow news day for everyone else. So they all came to Dutchess County and they all went to Pine Plains. So I'm just putting that out there that when you're thinking about public information, just remember they're right there. Requesting resources. The towns and villages really need to request their resources either from other towns and villages and city to the county, to New York State, to the federal government. I have witnessed a couple of times where certain cities or towns or villages, oh, I have a friend at FEMA, I'll just call them up and ask them. And then by the time that they get a hold of this friend and they discuss it, the FEMA says, I can't give you that. So the best way to go is to follow the chain of command because that way you're gonna get whatever resource you need quicker and you're gonna avoid duplication of efforts. Because there's also people who, oh, I have a friend that works for the governor's office and sometimes it doesn't get processed as quickly as possible. Or there have been times with duplication of efforts. Now Tom works in our emergency operations center a lot and he has to go out and help us figure out some of these request processes, right, Tom?
Yes.
Sometimes it's not easy. And something I also like to bring up, if you're gonna request something through the county, I want 2 people's name and phone number. During Hurricane Sandy, I called the same guy like 20 different times because he was literally on 50 requests. And he was sleeping because he was the only one on the request. So please, put down 2 names and 2 phone numbers. If not, great. I'd love to see 3. Make sense to you, Bill?
Yeah.
Resolving any resource allocation conflicts. That's the hard part is who gets the resources? Because does everyone have an unlimited personnel, supplies, equipment? No. So we're all working with scarce resources. So trying to figure out who gets the priority is challenging. Coordinating with all the whole community partners, think about who's in your town and village that you would want to coordinate. Which organizations would you want to work with? And then the multi-agency coordination group, which we'll talk about more later. So, does anyone have any questions on what NIMS is? And I want you guys to feel free to ask me questions. So if you have a question partway through a module, just let me know. NIMS command and coordination systems, anyone? Okay, we're breezing through number 2. Number 3. Now, so it's you guys, number 3 is the longest one. You can see up there, there's 43 slides. This is your instant command system organization and features. So, terminal objectives. Explain the NIMS management characteristics talk about the incident command system and what the role of the command and general staff is. Does this sound familiar to a lot of you guys? No, remember, you're just refreshing some of you. We're gonna describe the organizational structure, we're gonna talk about 15 management characteristics, the roles and responsibilities, and attributes and purpose of unified command and area command. Incident command system, we talked about NIMS a little bit, and a little bit about the incident command system, standardized. Because they want it to happen so that it's straight through nationwide. So if someone works in New York City versus Louisiana versus California, it's standardized. On scene, this is your boots on the ground. This is where the house fire is happening, this is where the flooding's happening. This is where whatever the incident actually is happening and you're saving lives. Okay? All hazards approach because there's man-made hazards, there's natural hazards, and cyber attack. Even though it's a challenge, and we're finding that more and more, if you don't have your computers, it's costing a lot of money to a lot of different people. We all saw the pipeline incident, so cybersecurity is huge as well. Basically, it allows us to adapt to match complexity and demands. You can have your simple incidents all the way to, do you know how many resources are at some of those fires out west? There are thousands of people that work on those. And they all cross boundaries, if not towns, villages, cities, sometimes counties, sometimes states. So they all have to work together. There is no such thing as jurisdictional boundaries. Basically, we gotta remember from a lot of the classes in firefighters, the safety of responders is the #1 priority. ICS helps to work on that. But what I also want you to think about is, yes, it's the safety of responders, but it's also the safety of the public. These are the residents that actually live in your towns and villages and county, and these are the visitors who come to, whatever it is, whether they come to have dinner, whether they come to see a show, whether they come to the fair, whatever it is that they come to, Flag Day, things like that. The achievement of tactical objectives. Because this is actually boots on the ground, these are where the tactical objectives. Put out the fire. Evacuate people from a hazardous materials incident. So it's all those types of things. It's actually what's happening at the scene of the incident or event that became an incident. The efficient use of resources. This is the hardest part, is because you need to ask for more resources, but how much more do you need? And having a good situational assessment or common operating picture, you can figure out what resources you actually need, and you can figure out what you actually have to request. I'm not saying you're always going to get it. For example, one of the great things about New York State is we have one tub grinder in the entire New York State, and they don't share it. So I can't tell you how many times over the last 18 years that one organization's like, we can't afford to share it. But Columbia County actually asked me for that in July of 2003, which is scary part is I still remember that. So Tom, like I said, what happens in Columbia County stays in Columbia County. I was asked for a tub grinder. I'm like, I don't think we have one, but we do have one, and it's really hard to get. So when I'm talking about resources, it's interesting because when I first started, we had one actual spot that had all of our resources for New York State Office of Emergency Management. And you're laughing because you know where it was. Where was it? Yep. So now we have 10 different stockpiles, which I think is awesome and amazing. So if you need something, you don't have to go, if you're on Long Island, you don't have to travel a couple hours. There's one in each region, and you can go out and get the items quicker and more efficiently. So having 10 different stockpiles across New York State is a great way to deal with emergencies and disasters. Examples of incident management using ICS. Fire, we talked about that. Structure fire, wildland fire, natural disasters, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes. New York State has actually gotten a couple of federally declared disasters due to earthquakes, which is amazing to me in the northern part. Search and rescue, human and animal disease outbreaks, criminal acts, terrorist attacks. Like I mentioned earlier, presidential visits are great. New York City does a great job. Every time that the United Nations has their conference, General Assembly conference every year in September, they actually activate a lot of different people to work together to monitor the situation. And every time the president comes to town, they actually spend a lot of time preparing for where he's going to be and making sure the safety and security is as important as they can. Other planned events, you guys have parades in different areas, things like that. That can be used for incident command. Basically, we talked about any kind, size, or complexity. I always suggest to have a variety of people from different places. So for example, if I was developing a planning team for like something, I would want to involve, first of all, you're always gonna have fire, law, EMS. Public Works has a lot of great vehicles and a lot of personnel that have good information. So there are always people I'd like to invite, hospital, health departments, people like that. But there's also local businesses that know things and have different information. So think about who you would want to have in your common operating management picture. If you were to have an incident or just a planned event in your area, your town or village. Logistical administrative support. Logistical, just knowing what equipment supplies you have, knowing what your neighbors have. Fire departments are great at this because they always know what the other town or village next door has as far as equipment, supplies, because they always borrow it. They go mutual aid on a regular basis. Public Works, things like that. It's also cost effective by avoiding duplication of efforts. I love duplication of efforts. It's one of my favorite things working for the state of New York. I get a phone call from the Watch Center and I'm asked to find out something about an incident. So I start working on it. And then partway through, I figure out someone else is doing the exact same incident as me. And I'm like, okay, great. So don't be like New York State. Duplication of efforts is very frustrating because we're asking the same people the same questions. And I know I do that to you guys, and Jean does that to you guys, and Nicole does that to you guys. So I profoundly apologized for that. But, that's why I say, find out what's going on, work together. And no, it's not the Watch Center's fault.
No, we
So-
don't, I get it, we do a lot of people there.
But it's just kind of funny because I figure I'm hourly employee, so it doesn't phase me. But those people that are not hourly employees and those that we have to torture. So I just, ICS organization. It's interesting because on a day-to-day basis, I report to a guy named Gene Lucchese. But sometimes I'm sent to another part of the state. And then whoever I actually report to changes. So even though Gene does my time card and I let him know where I am and what I'm doing, I report to that person. So it's kind of like that with the incident command system. In a normal day, you might report to, like Bill reports to the sheriff. But if he's sent out to an incident, he might be reporting to the state police guy because they're the incident commander on the scene. So everything kind of changes with the incident command system. It's whoever you report to at the actual scene. And rank might change. A chief might actually not be a chief at the actual incident. So it's really important under the incident command system, everyone kind of reports to everyone. So it's a little bit more complex, but when you get there and you work an actual incident, how many people have actually been at the scene of a large incident where they've held an incident command position? Couple of people. It comes together as you're there, correct? Structure. We have an incident commander. And then we have the operations section, planning section, logistics section, finance and administration. And we go through, there's a slide later on that says exactly what they do. NIMS management characteristics. Common terminology, these are basically coming up anyway. Common terminology. One of the things that I love is abbreviations. Because we all have abbreviations for everything. But if you're in a meeting with various people, sometimes not everyone knows and understands. Has anyone in this room ever been in a meeting and they're talking all these abbreviations and you have no idea what they're talking about? Exactly. So abbreviations, I am the abbreviations police. I actually have a Dutchess County Recovery and Resiliency Group. I love them. I make money off of it. Because the person in charge, if he starts using abbreviations, has to give me a quarter every time he uses an abbreviation. And trust me, I get $2 or $3 every meeting. Don't tell anyone that, I don't put it on my taxes. So, but the important thing is use plain language. When we're talking about common terminology, explain exactly what you need, because if I said to you, Mark, I need a bus, what are you gonna give me? Are you gonna give me a bus or?
Whatever's available, made up to your needs.
Are you gonna give me an ambulance? That's why something else that we'll talk about, which is kind of off topic, but if you give us a request for something you need, tell us what your mission is. Because if your mission is to close a road, how many different ways are there really to close a road?
Many.
Exactly. You could put some of those cute little orange cones up for a couple of days. You could use a barricade. Now, the bridge is out. Do you want to use a couple of cute orange cones or a barricade? Or do you want one of those big, huge cement Jersey barriers that says road closed so that no one goes off that bridge, especially at night? So when I said roads closed, tell us why. Because, we go through this a lot. We need to know what your mission is. And that's why it's really important to be very specific. Common terminology, be very specific on what you need, or resource titles. Don't use text, don't use codes. Just tell us exactly what you're looking for. Management by objectives. Put out the fire at the building. That's a simple objective. It probably isn't a smart objective because it's not specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, timely, but it is an objective. And it's simple because that's what you actually have to do. So, evacuate homes that are within a mile of the hazardous materials incident. That's objectives. That's what incident command system does, is the incident commander comes up with what the objectives is and then develops the tactics to meet the objectives. Incident action planning. Has anyone actually written an incident action plan? Incident action plans aren't that bad if you get someone else to write them. Just kidding. Once you get the objectives, then everything else kind of, then you have to develop a name. One of the great things about New York State is we usually follow the names that are given by National Weather Service for Tropical Storm Ida, or whatever the major incident might be. The snowstorm, Snowbud was one of them, I think, a couple of years ago. So an incident action plan, it talks about what the actual incident objectives are, which is developed by the incident commander. And then how you actually want to do that, because you have the objective, and then what activities do you actually do in order to meet the objectives? Specific time frame. Sometimes there are 8 hours, 12 hours, a day or two. I've seen incident action plans that are like a week long. So it all depends on how fast and how much this incident is actually evolving. For example, that we all just saw these vaccination sites that were run by the state. They did incident action plans for a week, because most of the time, most of the people were there for a week. Now, because New York State OEM, we were kind of different. We were there 2-3 days, and then someone else was there. So we just put a lot of different names and phone numbers in the actual incident action plan. But it's based on time frame, which is the operational period. Oral and written. It's interesting because almost every incident action plan is just talked about. The objectives are talked about. Written plans. Has anyone ever had to do a written plan for a hazardous materials incident? Because they're supposed to be written no matter what. If an incident action plan wasn't written for something like a hazardous material incident and something happened, the liability is huge. So I always stress, find someone from New York State, if you end up with a hazardous material, ask for someone to come in and do your incident action plan. Because there's a lot of people from New York State, DEC and OFPC, Department of Environmental Conservation, and Office of Fire Prevention and Control, and they do a lot of these, or ask for emergency management's help. into account legal and policy. Like I mentioned, legal is huge, especially if something happens. ICS is modular, starts from the top down. It's based on the size and complexity. Because we kind of already talked about a structure fire versus a hazardous materials incident, it can grow. And that's the important thing, because once you figure out what's really going on, the fire that turned into the hazmat, which turned into right next to the railroad and a quarter mile from the school. That's a huge incident versus a structure fire in one building. So I like to make things very complex. Modular organization, it's the size, any functions or positions. Sometimes you might have someone that does multiple functions or things like that. Just put their name in a couple of different boxes. Don't necessarily combine the positions, but just put their name in multiple boxes. It makes it easier. Because if they have to replace someone or it becomes a larger incident, you can easily just replace the name. Everyone has to have a person in charge. So there's always got to be a section chief. Span of control. We all know span of control is interesting because it says guideline is 1 to 5 ratio. So Bill, we'll put you on the spot. You have 10 sheriff's vehicles with personnel and they're securing one area. Do you need to have the 1 to 5 span of control, or do you think you would be able to supervise 10 people?
I could probably supervise 10 people, but span of control is optimum is 5 to 7.
Correct, optimum is 5 to 7, but if they're all kind of doing the same thing and, by the time, but then if they were all doing different tasks and orientation, you would need to deal with span of control and, do it that way. So what I'm trying to get at is sometimes 1 to 5 to 7 is ideal, but sometimes based on whatever's happening, it might be a little overkill. So use your judgment, and they say that in here, best judgment. What can you actually supervise effectively? Because you want to make sure that you know what's going on. You want to make sure that you can supervise effectively those people. Comprehensive resource management. We talked about this a lot already, personnel, equipment, supplies, and facilities. Making sure you know what resources you have, what resources you don't have that you could get from others nearby, or gaps. We always kind of look at that gaps. What do you actually need to borrow from the state or from the county? It's also really important to maintain your equipment, because it's great to get new communications equipment, but every once in a while you're gonna have to maintain it or upgrade. And so you have to, that's with any type of resources. It's also important to deal with reimbursement. So for example, if you were to have a big incident and fire trucks were used at the incident, we want to know how long those fire trucks were used, because they could go into federal reimbursement. And equipment rates are sometimes pretty sizable, correct, George?
Yes.
So you want to make sure you know this fire truck was used Monday through Friday from like 8 to 8 because you were supervising, you were doing this or doing that, whatever the equipment or supplies is, you want to know exactly when it was used so that you can get reimbursed. Federal reimbursement is great because it is a 75-25 match, but 75% of $100,000 is still $75,000. So it can add up. Integrated communications. Communications is difficult, especially in this area, because I know this is a shock. Some places don't have cell service in Columbia County. I am completely shocked.
I heard that. I have the phone in my hand, I'm looking at the tower and I can't use.
What I find interesting is I could go skiing at Catamount Ski Area and I have great cell phone reception because I have a Verizon cell phone right in the middle of the mountain, and I can basically get calls everywhere on that mountain. And it's great. The smartest thing they ever did with skiers that, the mother, father bring their kids and they're like, okay kids, go there. And they can still communicate because they know they have cell phone service, so they just send them on their way, and it's a good way to go. But yes, so communications can be a challenge. Does anyone deal with satellite phones at all? Anyone have satellite phones? Satellite phones can be a positive/negative because on a cloudy day and the world just isn't the right way, satellite phones are not as easy to use as people think. So everything has its pluses and minuses. Cellular. How many people here still have landline phone lines at home? I do. Because if all else fails, sometimes the landline is the only way to go. Because, you know, a lot of people have these cable internet phones. It's great, 3 in 1. But then when the cable's out, everything's out. So it's difficult. So communications. And we all know sometimes, you know, for example, the law enforcement or the fire companies trying to communicate between each other. One, radio's not perfect either. And the minute you get into some of these older buildings, that makes it challenging too. Like for example, Taconic School. There's not a great great radio from inside the building to outside the building. Because we did an exercise there and it's not easy. And the same with the college, certain buildings. And nursing homes. Nursing homes are typically brick buildings. They're horrible for cell phone reception, they're horrible for radio reception. They're just a challenge in itself. So communication, it's really important to know the best way to communicate based on where the incident is. Transfer of command and establishing command. It's interesting because, you know, everyone's like, oh, well, we don't need to transfer command. But if you're gonna be there a couple of days, you're gonna actually have to transfer command at some point. So it's really important to know how you're gonna transfer command. We always recommend that you do it, first of all, face-to-face. Doing things over the phone is challenging, but that way you can look at someone, you can ask questions. You know, typically an operational period at the beginning is usually like 19 to 26 hours at the beginning of any incident. And then we figure out how to get people some rest and bring them back and transfer to different people. But that takes some time. So when you think about it, you want to be able to transfer command as quickly as possible. You want to know exactly what the other person needs to know. I've been in enough emergency operations centers where 12 on, 12 off is never 12 on, 12 off. It's more like 12 to 15 on, and if you're out of there the earliest 13 to 14 hours, you're doing good. Tom, you agree?
Yes.
Okay. Sometimes transferring to the other person, you're in the middle of something, you can't actually tell them everything you need to know immediately. So transferring, especially being in charge of a structure fire that might be a couple of days, or you're in charge of evacuating because of the hazardous material. Sometimes it's gonna take a while to transfer, or just emergency operations center, just transferring from one person to another. It just takes time. And I always say to people, consider a 12.5-hour shift as the earliest. Because there are those people who are like, oh, well, my shift is over, Zoom they go. But I also recommend taking notes. Because I always take notes through my entire 12 hours, because I'm not going to remember everything I need to tell the person that's replacing me. So I take notes. Sometimes in the middle, I'll send an email of, hey, I just filled out this form and sent it in, just so you have this for your situational awareness. New York Response is how we actually prioritize our resources and our resource request process. So sometimes, because if you don't write down a number, it's really hard to find the request later on. So I also keep notes of what the request is and the request number. So for example, I need swift water rescue teams, which I needed a lot of those during Hurricane Sandy. Swift water rescue teams is request number ABCD. And I make sure I have a short little list so that in my mind, I don't have to go hunting for it if they say, how's this request coming? So when you're talking about transfer of command, think about it through the entire shift that you're doing. Whether it's in the EOC, whether it's the incident commander, whether you're the public information officer, or whether you're planning section chief. Anything that you're doing at the incident, you want to make sure that you're ready to get the next person all the information they need. Because there's nothing worse than figuring out partway through the next incident operational period that you don't have everything you need and you have to call that person. And they're probably sleeping with their cell phone off. Chain of command and unity of command. Chain of command, we all have bosses, right? Everyone in this room has a boss. Chain of command is basically an orderly line of authority within the ranks of the incident management system. So for example, someone that works in operations might go to a branch section chief, or they might go to the incident commander, depending on how many levels are actually set up. Unity of command is, how many people in this room have more than one supervisor that they end up reporting to? Anyone? Bill, you guys. So unity of command, in the actual incident command structure, you only report to one person, which makes it a lot easier. Like I said, for the most part, when I'm in region, in my zone, I just report to Gene. But if I'm somewhere else, I report to that person and Gene, because remember, he's still doing my time card at the end of this. So he still has to kind of know what I'm doing and how things are going. So chain of command and unity of command are very important. Unified command, has anyone ever heard this term before? Unified command is when one jurisdiction, agency, or department or group doesn't have full authority. So this could be because of jurisdictional boundaries, just the actual incident itself. You know, if you have a search and rescue for someone, which is interesting because I love looking at the lost hiker things. And they bring a lot of different people for a lost hiker at, say, Taconic State Park. Say someone actually gets lost there, which, you know, could happen. Okay, so you can imagine, it's not just law enforcement or firefighters or EMS that are coming. Sometimes public works gets involved, the parks gets involved, and
Forest rangers, number one man.
forest rangers. Yep, so when you're talking about unified command, they all kind of get together to help figure out where the lost hiker is. So unified command is just bringing them all together, because one of the great things too is like, not all law enforcement or EMS or fire can talk to each other over the radio. But if you have everyone at the incident command post, you can talk to that person who can talk to whoever is needed at the incident command post. So it does work out well with unified command. And then everyone develops the objectives, which is to find the lost person safely. Makes it kind of easy, but kind of difficult. Dispatch and deployment. It's interesting because when I started with the immediate fire company, when I was still with the fire company, we had pagers. And when I started with New York State OEM, we had pagers. Now everything's by cell phone and everything's more intricate. But make sure you know how to dispatch people. Make sure you know how to get in touch with people if you need them during an emergency or disaster. How do towns and villages, how do you guys deal with if you have to call people back, recall people from the town or village? Do you have a water main break? How do you recall people that you would need to call into your emergency operations center?
Cell phone, most of us anyway.
Cell phones? Okay.
We have, we do have radio between, I was trying to think how to do it, but most of it was by cell phone.
Right, because nothing ever happens
No.
Monday through Friday, 8 to 4, it's Friday at 5:30.
It was cell phone.
Exactly. One of the important things is do not self-deploy. You know, it's interesting because in certain incidents, you're always gonna find self-deploy. You get that active shooter, do you think anyone from law enforcement's not gonna just self-deploy to there? Okay, so they called for the state police and Columbia County Sheriff's Office, but there's an MTA police person like 10 minutes away. You think they're not gonna show up too? And you know it though, right? So it's hard. Spontaneous people always deploy to help out, especially if they're very close to whatever the scene or incident is. Incident facilities and locations, there are specific ones for incident command. The incident command post, the base. Staging areas are where you bring in different resources that aren't needed right away, or you need to bring them in, get sorted out, and then bring them to where you need to go. So sometimes it takes a little time. So you might have a couple of fire trucks, EMS, law enforcement, public works, or whatever vehicles you need in there. Points of distribution, we saw a lot of that during the COVID outbreak, because points of distribution, sometimes face masks and personal protective equipment were given out in certain areas. And emergency shelters. Has any of the towns or villages or I mean, the county's opened up a couple of shelters over the years.
We did a, for that ice storm, our town hall had an emergency shelter for like a week.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because the emergency operations center was open for like 8 or 10 days during that because it was such a challenge. But what do people do, especially if you don't have a wood stove and you don't have electricity and you can't really be in your house? And there's not a lot of hotels and motels in Columbia County. And a lot of people, you know, it's hard to do and hard to deal with pets too. So opening up emergency.
At the college, we're a Red Cross shelter in the event of a large disaster or whatever.
Absolutely. And hopefully you have a spot.
Some of the ones that depending on pets, some of them accept pets, like church time, you can bring your pets too.
Something to think about at the college, where could you put the pets if people wanted to bring their pets? Just something to think about. Information and sharing. We always suggest trying to get a good situational awareness of what's happening. So for example, from the state, we love to call them as many times as possible to ask them, are there any injuries or deaths at whatever incident is? Are there any roads closed? Are there any critical facilities affected? You know, these are the questions that we're gonna start asking the county. So these are the type of questions that we're gonna ask for you. Is there anything that you need for resources? Anything you need, personnel, supplies, equipment, whatever it is? We're gonna ask you for information and for, you know, it's interesting because during Hurricane Irene, Columbia County didn't have as major issues as Greene County. But the important thing is, once Columbia County Emergency Management figured out and we worked with them, they went over and helped out with Greene County. So that's what sharing and helping out during an emergency. And that's all because we had the information. We knew what the situation was. So it's really important when we call up and ask what the situation is and whether you need anything. ICS, who does what? And I did promise you this slide was coming. The incident commander develops the objectives and is in charge of everything unless that person actually gives it up to others. So they are in charge of safety, they're in charge of PIO, they're in charge of operations, they're in charge of everything unless they designate it. Operations section is, you know, they take the objectives from the incident action plan and then they develop their own tactics and their own activities to actually meet the objectives. And then the planning section chief develops the incident action plan, and their goal is to work with the incident commander to develop the objectives and then figure out all the staff that's there, work on a communications plan and everything in the incident action plan, which isn't as easy as you would think because just the communication and medical plan can be very challenging. Logistics section is all about getting the resources, what supplies, equipment, personnel. Finance administration, that's who pays the bills in so many ways. They're the cost. They're the ones that figure out how much this is costing. And they're also the ones that deal with the contracts because we all know that during an emergency or disaster, you don't have to go with the 3-bid system. You can actually, and sometimes there's only a single bidder out there for certain things. So they're the ones that deal with contracts. But they're also there if there was an accident. So if someone got injured, they deal with the claims. Establishing incident command. Incident command is usually established by whoever's first on the scene. But as things go on, you know, if you have your active shooter, it's whoever gets there first. But chances are the first couple are gonna go inside. So it's whoever senior member of whichever law enforcement gets there and assumes incident command. And then they're gonna work with whoever else shows up. So it typically starts off with whoever gets there senior most, but it could transfer to someone else or it could stay there. Just because a higher ranking person comes in doesn't necessarily mean they're gonna take control. So it all depends on who's the most qualified. I love how they actually have that extenuated, most qualified. Because knowledge, skills, and experience. We all have different knowledge, skills, and experience too. Incident commander's role, leadership for the entire incident. They're the ones who actually get the policy direction from the MAC group or from senior officials. They're the ones that actually, because of, they need a good situational awareness or good common operating picture because they're the ones that are setting the objectives. They're the ones that are giving them to the planning section for the incident action plan. They're the ones in charge of safety unless they actually decide on a safety officer. They're the ones that delegates authority to others. So, for example, they could actually just put someone in charge of planning, someone in charge of operations. They work with the EOC or Joint Information. They provide information to everyone, internally in their organization or externally to whoever needs it. And they also work with other agencies, whatever, they're the liaison. So the incident commander has a lot of role and responsibilities unless they designate it. I always, if I'm ever an incident commander, I'm gonna sit there and designate to everyone. Sound like a good plan? Depending on the size of the incident and complexity too. Senior officials' role in incident command. Basically, if you're working for a town or village, you want to have some interaction with whoever's in charge. Now, if it's a house fire, you can, call or see if they need something. But if it's like the hazmat, you might wanna have more of a conversation. And remember that there's always legal activities associated with this. And you wanna make sure that there's coordination and support between the incident command and if you have your emergency operations center open locally. So you wanna make sure that the fire chief or law enforcement or whoever's in charge, public works, because if it's a water main break, it's public works that's in charge. So it's whoever's in charge. Delegation of authority, this is all in your book. These are things to recommend if you decide to do a delegation of authority and give the control of the scene to someone else. Does everyone remember there was a dam collapse in Washington County? Then what they did was they decided to do a delegation of authority and label it the state takeover because it was a huge incident and became more cumbersome than they were ready to handle. So they did a delegation of authority. So think about what you could actually handle, working with the county, working with the state, or whether you just, sometimes it's easier and more productive because no one has a lot of extra staff and personnel. We all have so many different hats that we wear that it's really hard to give up that amount of time to deal with an incident like that.
Is there any time that the state would just come in and say, we're taking over?
The only time the state would come in and take over is like a state facility. So if you had an active shooter at a SUNY school, or a state office building, or something that the state owns and operates and is responsible for, they're definitely gonna come in and take over. But they also, if you have a structure fire at a state building, it's still gonna be the local fire department that's putting it out. We might come in and talk to you, but it's still gonna be you guys. And if it's an active shooter at a state building, there's still gonna be county law enforcement's gonna be there. So even though we're kind of in charge because it's our building, it's gonna be everyone anyway. It's gonna be unified command even more. So summary, incident command, we kind of already talked about these. Manage the incident is the incident commander, EOC works with the incident commander, and EOC is really supporting whatever the incident needs. MAC group is developing the policies and procedures that go along with the incident, or what their plan already is. Joint information really is dealing with the public information. Command staff, you have, for any incident, you have public information officer, liaison officer, safety officer. And they're just as easy. Public information deals with just handing out whatever public information is needed using social media, because there's a lot of different social media that can come up. Dealing with the liaison thing, there might be other agencies or departments or public buildings or just regular businesses that have to be involved. So they work with them. Safety officer, I always recommend designating one of those for just about everything. Because, you want someone fresh just to look at the safety of everything. General staff is your operations section, planning section, logistics, and finance admin. Incident management team is basically your command and general staff. That's your entire incident management team from incident command system. Complexity and resource needs. The more complex an incident, the more you need resources. So on the bottom lower is very simple, complex issues, you know? You have your one car accident, you have your EMS call, very simple in ICS. But then you have your building collapse, and maybe the other one's an active shooter, and so you have a lot more in ICS. So the more complex, the more ICS you need. If your agency or jurisdiction, what factors may influence the complexity of the incident? This goes out to you guys. What do you think makes an incident more complex than others?
I think so.
Location?
Location. Location can be big, and the type of incident.
Victims and potential victims.
Victims, yes.
Time of the day.
Time of the day is an important one, because we all know it, during the day, sometimes it's harder to get volunteers out. Now, fire is 100% volunteer in Columbia County, correct? I wanted to emphasize that so that everyone knew and understand.
And in this part of the country, time of year.
Time of year, absolutely. Because if you have something in the middle of a snowstorm, that always adds a little bit challenge to it.
In our situation with the college, also multiple buildings. Could make it very, very complex.
Absolutely. Okay, some really good answers. How long will a complex incident last?
Till it's done.
Good answer, that's right, that's one of the best answers. A complex incident could be a couple hours, could be a couple of days, could be a couple of weeks. We're still in COVID. And I'll tell you something, COVID is coming back, unfortunately, which is kind of scary. How long do we need to be self-sufficient?
72 hours.
At least 72 hours. It all depends on what the incident is and how quickly you can get other resources in to backfill whatever you need to. How we know the incident is over?
The bills start coming. The phone stops ringing.
You kind of just start going back to normalcy. You know, for a lot of people, they go back to work, the kids go back to school, grocery stores reopen. You know, they always say there's that one restaurant, if that's reopened, then you know that they're well on their way to recovery. And which one is that? The name escapes me. It's the one down south, and the Pancake House. Once that is reopened, exactly. Once that's reopened, then they know that you know the situation is back under control. Expanding incident. On a chilly autumn day, ooh, we're in autumn, this works out perfectly. A parent calls 911 to report a missing 7-year-old child in a wooded area adjacent to a coastal area, but they're just gonna be right next to a river.
Or the river.
A river, love it.
Yeah.
So this is the type of, you know, you might have an incident command, and it might just be a couple of different people. But as additional personnel and supplies, because now you're 3 to 4 hours into this incident, you have an operations section chief, you need to increase your span of control because you haven't found him and it's been 4 hours already. As the incident expands, the ICS chart expands as well. And then as it gets even more, because now, you know, you're 12 hours into this and you still haven't found this child, you could have hundreds of responders. And volunteers are great as long as you help work with them and make sure that they're supervised properly. So you might have to add more people. Unified command does not affect individual agency authority. And that's an important part because you're bringing people together to develop a common set of objectives. Basically, you're developing one individual action plan, one command structure, unified command, and everyone has their same responsibilities, but you're just working together as a team to develop however you're going to handle the situation. Definition of area command is typically, so for example, a town or village might have a tornado go through, and you might have 3 different areas that were impacted from the tornado. So you might have road A, road B, and road C. So you're gonna have 3 different incident commanders commanders at each one dealing with whatever it is. So that could be area command. So you're actually, because your emergency operations center is open, and then you have 3 different road areas that were affected by the tornado. Anyone have any questions on section 3, module 3? Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're at 7:56. We're gonna take a break till about 8:05. Does that sound good to everyone? Now, remember that in that is the chocolate cookies with the M&Ms. So if anyone wants to help themselves, so we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll move on to module 4.
Somebody's gotta
But these are a lot shorter than Unit 3. Unit 3 was our long one. Unit 4, IMS coordination. We're gonna talk about the attributes and purpose of emergency operations centers.
Yes.
And like I mentioned, we already talked a little bit about emergency operations centers. We're gonna talk about the functions and structures of the emergency operations centers and how the direction provided by the senior official, which is your town, village, county officials, matter to the EOC. NIMS components, we talked about, so far we talked about the incident command center, and now we're gonna talk about emergency operations center. And the next module is multi-agency coordination groups and joint information systems. Now we're back to this new complex one, which if you're looking at local, you have your MAC groups, multi-agency coordination groups. And then you also have your emergency operations center, which we kind of already talked about. Some are working on getting an emergency operations center, the county has one. And the county really has one. You know, a lot of the times, if I were to suggest to someone what you need in your emergency operations center, you need to have some type of Wi-Fi connectivity because you want to be able to use the internet and different other things. You want to have televisions because you want to kind of know what's going on in the world and whether there's anything local, like Albany has a local station, am I correct? Television station? Yes. So you kind of get a little bit of localness. There's a station that I get out of Westchester County, which I find very interesting because they do a lot of COVID specials from 9 a.m. to 9:30 a.m., Monday through Friday, that they bring in an expert, which I don't know what makes them an expert, but they bring people in and they talk about COVID. And sometimes the information is, yes, experts can be interesting. So, you know, emergency operations centers. So we'll go through this a little bit. EOC functions. Like I was talking to Roy at the break, emergency operations centers, you need to be able to find out what the situation is. You need to be able to get a common operating picture of any injuries or deaths, or any roads closed, or if there's something going on with for example, sometimes there are problems at jails. For example, during the tornadoes in 2018 in Putnam County, they had problems at their jail. And that's an important part because what happens if you have to relocate a jail? Do you think that would be fun, Bill? I said to them point blank that day, I was going to get them a generator or I was going to get them electricity back online by the time I left that night, and that was Thursday. And I might have said some things to some people that I might not have, should have. But, yeah, relocating a jail is not something that's easy to do. So when NYSEG said, well, we might be able to get you the electricity back to the jail tomorrow, I might have explained at noon that day that that was not good enough. And they ended up bringing crews and readjusting and got the jail up that day at 8:30 that night. But they got it back up. And believe me, because their generator was having issues, that was not going to be a good time. So these are the information you need, because working at an emergency operations center, you need to know what the issues are and try to figure out how to solve them. Because certain things like evacuating a hospital or evacuating a nursing home, it's done. I have to admit that during Hurricane Sandy, I was actually in New York City, but in Westchester County, one of the nursing homes has like 20 patients on ventilators. How much fun do you think it is to transfer 20 patients that are on ventilators to another place? It's scary, because anything that goes in the slightest bit wrong, those people will not make it. So it's finding out what's going on, finding out what roads are closed, finding out what area needs to get help. We also know that in these days and times, there's a lot of differential of income and people that can take care of themselves versus people that have a little bit more expendable funds that can go to the hotel or go to family. So it's also important to remember that. Something that comes up more and more is dealing with special needs. it's really important when you're looking at your plans, policies, and procedures, you start working on working with people that have special needs or developmental issues, because there are lawsuits out there. There are cities and towns that have been sued because you're not taking care of the vulnerable population during planning. We want to basically, for emergency operations centers, it's not boots on the ground, we're helping out the incident command post. Those are the people actually doing the work, so we want to support them. So sometimes we have to help by coordinating, developing policies, developing procedures, or getting resources, or whatever it is. EOC organizational structure. It's interesting, because like I said, I've been here 18 years, and I've been in EOCs all the way from the town and village to the city of New York, to Nassau and Suffolk County, to New York. Actually, I've never been to New York State EOC during a major incident, because I'm always somewhere else. But there's been a lot of different variations on how you actually run your EOC. And so a lot of it is, you know, if you've ever been to an EOC activation, a lot of it is, you know, you just kind of have to work through it as who's there. And I found that's very interesting, because I was in Putnam County for a couple of times. They had severe winter storm, and then they had the tornadoes in 2018. And it was interesting, because there was a different atmosphere based on who was there the second time versus who wasn't. And the great thing is, the state sometimes sends a lot of people in. So for example, during the tornado, the second night, there was more state people in the EOC than there was Putnam County staff, which was kind of interesting. But it worked, and it got things done. So there are different structures. You could do ICS, like you could have your branch sections. You could do some type of incident support module, where you're just looking at what the incident is and bringing in experts there. By department, fire department, law enforcement, bringing those in. EOC benefits. One of the great things is you actually can share what's going on. If you were to open up your EOC, where do you get information? How do you know? Because you're in a room. How do you know what's going on outside? Where do you get your information from? TV scan. People in the field. And that's what you rely on. So for example, if I'm in the EOC, law enforcement's always on the road. Fire departments might be there, public works might be there. Social media is great too, because they're always posting pictures of whatever's out there. I always try to look at, all my counties have emergency management Facebook pages. I always try to look at those and see what's going on. But there's a lot of information in social media. And there's a lot of different people that are just driving around for various reasons. So looking at those, and that's why you're trying to get a shared situational report. Information verification. If you have everyone in one room, and for example, I say to you, okay, Bill, Route 23 is closed. And you're like, it is? I didn't know that. So we can reach out to whoever's closest by, and maybe it's law enforcement, or maybe you know an ambulance just went to Hudson, to the Columbia Memorial Hospital, so you can ask that ambulance, hey, you guys were just on 23, was it closed? So, you know, there's a number of different ways that you can find out whether Route 23 is closed, or whatever road's closed, because you just ask the question. So if you have everyone in the EOC, you can simply just turn and ask. It also helps with long-term operations. If this is gonna be a day or two or a couple hours, it's gonna be a lot easier if everyone's together and working on the goals and objectives together. Increases continuity. Like I mentioned, transferring of command. So for example, if you have your EOC open, you can have people come in, look at the documents, and work through it. So it makes it a little bit easier. Provide ready access to all available information. Now, in the first couple hours, or the first hour or two, sometimes there's very little information. But by working together to get all the information from every resource that you have, you can actually get a good situational awareness. You can also have access to whatever is needed as far as available information. And resources. Because it's interesting, because you also bring everyone together to an ELC. Sometimes they tell you that they have certain resources that you didn't know that they had. So for example, Public Works might have a specialty vehicle that you didn't know about. Or you might, for example, need something from the state and you figure out, well, we need to rescue people, and you're like, oh, what do we do? And you find out from your state representative, oh, we have a high axle vehicle sitting in Newburgh that can come help out. So it's getting people together so that you can find out the secret resources that you didn't always know that they had. EOC and the senior official. I think we all in this room know that finances are tough right now, correct? Finances not, and no one has a lot of extra money in their budgets. So when you talk about EOC, you might be able to figure out how to save money, cost savings. You may have to authorize expenditures that you didn't need to or didn't want to spend. But make sure you have documentation. If you're gonna open up your EOC, one of the first people I always suggest is someone who loves to take notes. Because you want documentation. I was actually at an EOC, and what they did was they took a flipboard and they just wrote all the different things that they were doing. And then at the end, they just put it all around the room. And I worked the overnight shift, so my job was to go around and take those pieces of paper and type it into notes. And I had no problem doing that. I thought that was great. What else are you gonna do on the overnight? There wasn't a lot going on. But make sure everyone knows what's going on. And that's why I suggest take great notes, because first of all, you're not gonna remember everything. Second of all, it can help you lessons learned afterwards. Third of all, it helps you for reimbursement, and fourth of all, it helps you liability-wise. So there's a lot of good reasons to take good notes, and especially if it's more complex or difficult issues. Senior official macro guidance to the EOC, which would be your town supervisor. Basically, you're delegating the appropriate authority to whoever's in charge of the EOC. I don't know, who do you guys usually use if you're opening your EOC on the local level? Who's in charge of the EOC?
Town supervisor,
Yeah?
it's out, if you're doing so.
The mayor, the mayor, yeah, absolutely, okay. Issue an initial policy. So when you open up your EOC, you might wanna have, a lot of the times whoever's in charge, like the county executive or the town supervisor, will just go out and talk and explain how you're gonna run the EOC for that operational period. And then reporting requirements. New York State's great for reporting requirements sometimes. Sometimes, right, Tom? Sometimes, okay. So, sometimes, reporting requirements, if I had my choice, unless it's a rapidly escalating incident, I would wanna do at just about every 6 hours. So like maybe noon, 6, noon, midnight, 6 or something, or better yet, 8 AM to 2 PM to 8 PM. No one's ever up at, I love doing situation reports for 6 AM because none of my counties are awake. And no one wants to answer emails or text messages at 5:30 AM when I have to do a situation report. So I always tell them, if you have something to report, send it to me. If not, I will presume you do not have anything to report. And that's always our system. And it works very well. Because I'm the only one of us that has to get up and write that. None of the counties reported anything. And it's a very simple situation report. Sometimes I'll look up, power outages, road closed, and various other emails just to see if I see anything interesting that might be perceived as a major incident in my zone. But reporting requirements. So think about how you want to have reporting requirements to the EOC. Determine the decision-making process. Is it everyone doing unified command, or is the mayor going to actually just be in charge and make the final decision? Or is the mayor going to listen and discuss it and then make it, based on what he or she hears? Fiscal issues are always a problem, and possible parameters for the EOC. Level priorities. It's really hard sometimes to figure out where the priorities are in the EOC. For New York State, it's really challenging because once you have New York City and Long Island, sometimes they take a lot of the resources that the state has. And let's be real, the population base is down there. So that's why a lot of the times they get more of the items than the rest of the counties because of where, how many they have living there. Objectives review. Does anyone have any questions on emergency operations centers? We talked about the functions and structure. We talked about how the senior official or the town supervisor, mayor, or village or city or county deals with the emergency operations center. Anyone have any questions, any thoughts? One of the things that I think most important for emergency operations centers, if you were to do a drill tomorrow, do a call down drill. Just look up all the phone numbers that you have listed and see if they actually all work. It's simple, it's easy, but it's something that, doesn't always think about it. I'm on a mutual aid coordinating entity with 32 hospitals in the lower Hudson Valley, and I'm in charge of their communication plan, well, their contact list. Can't really say it's a communication plan, it's a simple contact list. And I send it out 2-3 times a year and I say, anyone have any changes? I love these people who, 6 years later, I find out that their name is misspelled. Well, you didn't figure that out in the first 5.5 years, but I changed their spelling of their name. It's not like it changed from one to the next, but, so the important thing is make sure your contact lists are up to date, or email addresses, because there's nothing worse than being in the heat of the battle and you're looking for someone and their cell phone is off by 1 digit. Instead of 54, it's 53. So that's my lesson on that. Just make sure you can contact who you need to. Any questions or anyone want to discuss anything more for emergency operations centers? Okay, now we're going to talk about MAC groups and the Joint Information System. Explain the interconnectivity between MAC group, EOCs, the Joint Information Center, and Instant Command. Functions and purpose of a multi-agency coordination group, functions and purpose of a joint information system, and then how they all interconnect. We talked about instant command system, we talked about emergency operations center, so we're down to the last two. Multi-agency coordination group. Basically, these are the people, like for example, if I was in charge of a county, say I became the county emergency manager for a special county called Baxter County, which is my dog's name. I would want to make sure on my multi-agency coordination group, obviously I need my responders, fire, law, EMS, public works. When you think about most emergencies and disasters, public works has to do something, whether it's a tornado, blizzard, or something, they're always involved somehow. And then I would also look at my health department, office for the aging. I would also want someone from BOCES because schools are important. I would also, like I mentioned, hospitals. I would look at all the different county agencies and I would probably try to take every single one of them. And it's interesting because garbage, receptacles, trying to get someone from that, someone from the cable, someone from the phone company. So these are people I would want to have as a multi-agency coordination group. Basically, the multi-agency coordination group, when you're looking at it from a town, village, or county perspective, you're developing your policies, procedures, plans. I love checklists. Does anyone else like checklists? They work very easy. You print it off and check, check, check. Did I do this, this, and this? Works easy. Supports resource prioritization and allocation. Just figuring out how to deal with whatever the incident is and what resources, personnel, supplies, equipment, and how to actually send them out to the scene. Decision making. Decision making is sometimes more complex because you bring 5 people to the table and they have 5 different knowledge, skills, and experiences and abilities, and they all have different viewpoints. And sometimes that's not easy. So sometimes it's gotta be the village mayor or supervisor that just says, we're gonna do it this way. Sometimes you just listen to all the arguments and you just gotta make a decision. We always suggest having elected officials, some decision makers. Also, consider working with your other local towns, villages, and the county, if you need the county help. some other decision makers, so you might wanna have private organizations if it's gonna affect them a lot. If there's a company in town or something in town that is gonna have a lot of direct impacts, you might work with them. High-level subject matter experts, it's interesting, because I don't consider myself an expert on everything. But I usually can find someone who's an expert on everything. So if I need someone that knows a lot about chemicals, I find them. Or if I need someone that knows a lot about health department issues, I find them. So always ask what your mission is to work with that. Senior MAC group officials, you're basically dealing with whatever the mission and strategic development. Remember, we were talking earlier that the incident command post and ICS deals with tactics. This is strategy. This is just basically overall strategy and developing the operational priorities with the incident commander. Provide policy guidance for the EOC, for the incident command post and the Joint Information Center. Scarce resources. Sometimes during an incident, during Irene, one of the biggest things that we couldn't get was variable message signs. Because so many were used for roads closed, detour ahead. So it's something, scarce resources. You gotta figure out how you're going to get that information if you can't use a variable message sign or whatever the scarce resource is. Make sure you look at the mission, what you actually want to accomplish. You wanna actually be able to get the command authority to the incident commander or unified command. You wanna make that group make the decisions together, because it's not easy. You want to determine who will be invited to be included and where you will meet and how you will meet. Virtual meetings, it's interesting because, in the old days, emergency operations centers, everyone came together, but there's a lot of virtual as well. New York City Office of Emergency Management, when they do their virtual EOC, it's huge. It's not like it's 10 or 15, it's like 150 to 200 people on the network. So you have to have subgroups and sub-meetings and all this other stuff. It's very complex. So you can also do things virtually. Determine who will be involved, your initial policy statement, and determining the reporting requirements. Operational priorities, we've already talked about saving lives, protecting the property and the environment. See, I told you, this gets duplicated like 10 times throughout the whole slides. Stabilizing the incident, that means you want to do no further harm. You want to stabilize as much as possible. Basic human needs. After a hurricane or a major incident, you want to help people as much as possible. But remember that there's a limit that you can help with. So you can probably give them temporary housing and work with them to get American Red Cross to help them. I always consider short-term, medium-term, and long-term. So you might need short-term housing and you might be able to put them in your town hall or wherever the emergency shelter is. And medium-term housing, you might have to put people for a couple of weeks somewhere. And then long-term housing, if their houses are completely destroyed, it may take months if they can rebuild. So there's not a lot of extra housing. Does the towns and villages and cities and counties, do you guys have a lot of extra housing available to anyone? Apartments or houses? No, there's not a lot of extra. So remember that when you're looking at essential basic human needs, just finding a place for some of these people to live. Even an apartment house fire, can be a complex thing. Just making sure that they have their food, their water, their medications, clothing, and working with the American Red Cross. Essential utilities. You guys have a really good relationship with the electric company, but cable companies are important, as well as phone companies. As well as when you think about utilities, like the city of Hudson actually has water and septic. Do the towns and villages have water and septic in them? Yep. So that makes it, that's another utility that you're responsible for, and water and septic can be a very big challenge. Program functions, you're looking at what the programs are and making sure that everything is completed. Like I mentioned earlier, courthouse, it's something simple, but you also want to still have your town meetings, even if it's virtual. You want to still have some type of normalcy. Coordinate among appropriate stakeholders. You wanna know who's in your town, who's in the next town or village over, so that you can work together. And everything in emergency management somehow becomes political at some point in time. So politics is huge. Everything becomes political. So we talked a little bit about, so far we're up here, we talked about MAC groups, Emergency Operations Center. So now we're gonna talk about joint information systems. Joint information systems. This is your actual emergency information that you want to go out. Sometimes you want it to go out to the public as quickly as possible. But you need to make sure it's the correct information and accurate as much as possible. Because there's nothing worse than having rumors out there or false information. And it's really important that if you find rumors or false information, you have to work with that as well to make sure that the public really understand what's going on. Because you want to keep everyone safe. So you also work with the Joint Information System, you work with the Emergency Operations Center to make sure you have good situational awareness with them. You work with the incident commander to make sure our boots on the ground. You work with the PIO. Do you guys, who does your public information officer stuff at the town and village and county level?
For us, it's the village chair.
Lieutenant, what about towns and villages?
He's pointed at me, so.
So I guess.
It's the clerk.
Oh, it's the town clerk.
The village clerk. Well, I was gonna say too, we put in an email blast for our residents, that they can sign up, she could get on and put out.
Yeah, we have that on the
Boom,
website.
like that, and everybody's on the email blast.
Awesome. That's a great way to go. Especially because you can get the information that you want out to as many people as you can, as quickly as possible. Excellent. So joint information system works everyone together. So you could have separate PIOs, but they all need to have the same message. They all need to have the same information. So even if the MAC group, EOC, and Incident Command all had separate ones, just work together to make sure the residents and visitors and everyone gets the right information. Because, like I said, the public will find out that information and sometimes works off of it. We've talked about NIMS a lot, National Incident Management System. It's not necessarily a plan or a facility, it's a system. It's a group of ideas and concepts that works together from the dispatch of the actual situation to the actual on-scene command and incident command, to the coordination of resources, whether it's the incident command post, whether it's the EOC, MAC groups, and everyone kind of works together to get the mission accomplished, to get the tactical and strategic objectives met. Interconnectivity of NIMS, like I mentioned, this one's hard because when you look at it, you have your boots on the ground incident command post, and then they work with everyone else. So whether it's departmental operations centers, whether it's MAC groups, whether it's the EOC, whether it's the dispatch center. Dispatch center is also great because if you need something at the scene, incident command, you can ask the dispatch center and say, this is what we need. Review of the senior officials' role, which we've talked about a lot of these, safety, continuity of government, multi-agency coordination, and like I said, work with everyone else. Resolving resource allocation issues is a big one too, but just remember documentation is critical too. Any questions on what is the purpose of a multi-agency coordination group? What about the Joint Information Center and NIMS Command and Coordination Systems? Any questions? Any thoughts? Am I going too fast, too slow? Everyone okay with the pace? Okay. We're at Unit 6, preparedness. And we're at 8:36, so we're doing really good. Explain the senior official's role in preparedness. List senior official responsibility in preparing for an incident, FEMA doctrine, guidelines, and additional training. FEMA has a lot of great classes online. If you Google FEMA independent study courses, there's a lot of good ones. You can talk about hazardous materials, incident command classes, how to develop an exercise, how to deal with recovery issues. You know, there's literally hundreds of them online. And some of them, you know, you take them, they're interactive. Some of them have videos, some of them are just basically you read the documents. So there are some good classes. When I think of preparedness, I think of you know, it's like a big circle. You start off by developing plans, policies, procedures, checklists. Then you actually do training. You training on what the plans, policies, and procedures are. But when you think about it, if you do fire training or law enforcement training, any type of training helps out the overall picture, because the better you can do your job, the better everyone is, and the better the incident goes. So everyone who's more familiar with their own job and role and responsibility helps out. And then organizing and equipping, just knowing what you have for resources and getting what you don't have and dealing with whatever, you know, figuring out where the gaps are. Something that's always a big thing for most county is fatality management. Just knowing who you can count on if you have the incident, like the limousine incident, you know, that was a huge number. I mean, it really wasn't, but it was a huge number. Could the county handle like 20, 30 people? And the answer is probably no. So fatality management, you know, just looking at things like that. And then, so organizing and equipment and exercising. Has anyone ever been in a tabletop exercise from towns, villages? You know, just bringing people together to have a discussion-based exercise is a good way to go. And then, if you've ever done lesson learned, I do lessons learned on practically everything. So after an incident or event, you might want to look at your plans, policies, and procedures and make some changes. You know, it's interesting because everyone says do it annually, do it after an incident. Try to at least do it every 2 to 3 years. Try not to wait 10 to 15 years because a lot of the times that's what people end up doing. So kind of set your bookmark to do it at least every other year. Just bring the group together. Preparedness is identifying and assessing risk. I want each one of you to tell me what is your greatest risk or threat for your jurisdiction or school or business? Train. Train? Chemical leak?
From a train on the edge of the river.
Right.
Active shooter.
Active shooter?
Fire.
Fire? Well, it's a cigar establishment, so.
Large scale.
Large.
Not smoke.
Okay, Mark,
Flame.
what about you guys? What's your number one hazard that you worry about?
All the above.
There's a lot of things to worry about, natural hazards, ice storms, severe blizzards, nor'easters, because we're getting into the winter season. But severe summer storm, those tornadoes and severe wind events just keep happening. But we had a downdraft this summer. So that's,
Thanks for bringing
Yeah, right.
Bill was in charge, we were all out of town. Careful what we wish for. So there's a lot of different hazards that we look at. Estimating capability requirements, knowing what your town and village and county have as far as resources, or what's available at the county school, or what's available at the college, or what's available that you could get from other schools and jurisdictions. Building and sustaining capabilities. It's great to go out and buy some new equipment and supplies, but you have to sustain it. And at some point in time, after a couple of years, it might not even be workable. I live in the boondocks in Amenia and there's no cell service. So I bought a cell phone enhancer in 2015. And then it stopped working this year. I spent $250. Apparently it's not a lifetime guarantee. So apparently because of new cell phones and new technology, the old cell phone enhancer is done and you need to get a new one. So the important thing is you might have the best technology or the best supplies and equipment, but you have to stay up to date and you have to keep going with it. So just building and sustaining whatever capabilities you have. Planning to,
Just a thought I just had, like when you were talking about planning and stuff, probably a good exercise too, and I don't know how many of them actually do it. But as you develop the town plans and the village plans and stuff, it's good to be able to sit down at a tabletop and do them with your emergency responders, at least the initial ones, so that everybody's kind of familiar with the plan.
absolutely, so as you develop your emergency operations plan, work with the fire department, EMS, law enforcement, and public works, and whatever agency and department you wanna involve. Town clerks are always important. Building maintenance is also really important, whoever maintains your buildings, because they have the keys and they know where all the secret places are, and they know what's really in some buildings. So maintenance is also key, but yes, just getting together to have conversations. Even if you just do a simple, activity. Just getting everyone in the same room to talk about a simple tabletop exercise is a great way to go.
Well, especially so that because, we live in a small town, so everybody knows everybody, but if you live in a larger town, you may not know who your fire chief is. The people on the committee may not recognize who those other people are, and that can be important.
They also say that the more people that know each other before an incident, having a relationship building prior to an incident helps out during an incident. You don't wanna be exchanging business cards in the middle of a structure fire or in the middle of a railroad disaster with people that you just meet. I mean, yes, sometimes it happens, but the more you know and the more you interact beforehand and can be able to help out, the better off you are. Which goes into validating capabilities. It's your exercises. Or, it can be real life events. I mean, we've been living this COVID for like 3,000 years, right? It's been about 3,000 years. Okay, so, just being able to do that, reviewing and updating, like I mentioned, technology changes. So you need to really review and update your plans, policies, and procedures. So things like that, whole community, I also emphasize, think about who in your community you would wanna have on your planning team. Who would you wanna have at your emergency operations center? And it's not just it's based on whatever businesses are in the area that could be very beneficial or helpful. Obviously, the college and the school are important ones as well. So think about who's involved. Check plans, policies, and laws. NIMS terminology, like I just mentioned, it was just updated. So cover all hazards, think about all the hazards. The county does a county emergency preparedness assessment, and they have to rank like 30 different hazards. One of the great things about New York State is we don't require counties to develop plans, but if you want grant money, you have to fill out the plans. You actually have to complete certain plans and paperwork. So, for example, NIMS terminology has to be in their plan, and it has to cover all their hazards. So we actually make them do a county emergency preparedness assessment every 3 years, and they go through and they figure out what their top 5 hazards are, or they rank a bunch of hazards. So it's also, work with the county emergency management, who would probably be willing to share what their top hazards are, based on what the county feels. And the county emergency preparedness assessment is getting a whole bunch of different people from the county that comes in and ranks the hazards. For a while, they were having a big conversation about which is worse, an ice storm or flooding event, or flooding incident. Well, an ice storm happens less frequently, but it impacts more of the county. A flooding incident happens to less of the county, but happens more often. How do you rank that? They both are kind of horrible, so you kind of just deal with both of them. Is there a 1A, or tied for 1? So when you're looking at hazards, figure out which hazards are most likely to impact you. There was one county, and I will tell you, Putnam County, about 5 years ago, someone came in from the health department, and she said to us, pandemic is the worst thing you will ever see in your entire life, and it will affect every single thing that you will do in your lives. And we thought, okay, really, whatever, and, it became their number one hazard, and then she didn't come to the next meeting, so it dropped down the list, but she was right. And her name is Dr. Sharita Amler, and she's now in charge of the Westchester County Health Department. But that's just an example of know your hazards. She really knew her hazard, and she knew how bad it was gonna be. So when you're looking at hazards, think about those things. Delegations of authority, there's some information in those documents that we gave you on delegations of authority. Up-to-date information, make sure everything's current. Do you have establishing for keeping track of resources? Once you put stuff outside, New York State has a great challenge in locating certain resources. We can give out 20 light towers and it's really hard because someone has to sign for them. But sometimes they move locations, sometimes they go to other jurisdiction, and we have a rough time keeping track of them. So how do you keep track of your inventory or whatever resources you have out? Activities dispatching the resources, just, fire and EMS and law enforcement and public works, but what if you need other people out at the scene? Managing volunteers. Many moons ago, I was sent to Chautauqua County. Does anyone here know where Chautauqua County is? Way out there. And remember, I live in Amenia. So you can estimate how long it took me to drive from Amenia to Chautauqua. I get out there, and one of the things that I noticed was it was one of those flash flooding events where they got like 13 to 15 inches of rain in like 6 hours, and places that never flood, weren't in a flood zone, got flooded. And they had some fatalities, and it was a very challenging scene in many ways. But there's spontaneous volunteers. And there's positives and negatives to everything. I always tell people, there's positives and negatives to everything in our lives. Spontaneous volunteers are great if you know how to use them. Now, this was around July 4th, and who's not working in the summer months? Oh wait, teachers. They're off for the summer. So there was one very nice woman who every day, because she was off on vacation, would go into town and help clean out people's houses. Every single day. Spontaneous volunteer. She'd go to the American Red Cross, find out where she had to go, who needed help, elderly. She'd get on gloves, she'd get on masks, she'd go over and help take the mud out of someone's living room. And she did that for days. So when you're thinking about how to deal with volunteers, you gotta figure out where your issues really are, who needs help, and be able to work with them, because there are spontaneous volunteers. And like I said, some of them are very helpful. Demobilizing. That's a tricky thing, because you wanna make sure you have people there long enough, but not too long. Because remember, sometimes you're paying. So financial costs. But it's also important not to send them back too quick. So then you have to figure out recall. So it's really important, it's interesting, because sometimes people just don't wanna leave. And sometimes people wanna rush out the door. So demobilizing is a tricky concept. Financial keeping track of everything. This is important because when you think about it, you can sometimes get reimbursement from the federal government. So like I mentioned earlier, documentation is key. Do you have mutual aid agreements? Does anyone have mutual aid agreements? Fire and law and EMS do. There's also something called the Interstate Mutual Aid Program. Anyone heard this before? New York State developed the Interstate Mutual Aid Program, and when we get the final list, I will make sure that it's sent out to everyone on the list. We'll come up with the link. You can also look it up online. New York State has an interstate mutual aid agreement so that all towns, villages, cities, and counties are all in a mutual aid agreement with each other, unless you opt out. So you're already in it. So if you didn't know you're in it, now you know you're in it. So it actually works out well, because if the federal government comes to town and they want to give you money, and you're like, oh, we just went and helped Greene County out during the Hurricane Irene. Well, you can't get money unless you have a written mutual aid agreement, which I think Irene was one of the ones that made this interstate mutual aid agreement so important, because now everyone has mutual aid agreements with everyone. So if you go to help out, for example, Westchester County personnel went and helped out Delaware County for one of their floods on the river. So it works out perfectly because you're already in this mutual aid agreement, and it goes through specifics of how to deal with costs, It has to do with liability. So, like I said, mentioned New York State Interstate Mutual Aid Agreement. And it is an important part. And yes, a lot of people do have, that. This does not supplant something that you already have, but it adds to, so for example, Copic needed to have something with Hudson. They're not near each other, but they might help each other out, or from another county. Establishing communication. It's really hard sometimes to communicate, and that's why I say bring a runner in. Especially when you're talking mutual aid, different agencies, different departments. Our protocols and policies in effect. Now, you mentioned email. Email's a great way to go because then you have documentation. I love people who text everything because sometimes texts get lost or sometimes people don't see them. But, just do the best you can as far as communication. Set up a policy and procedure on how you're gonna work within your own organization and how you're gonna work with helping each other out. Do you have a plan of maintaining or replacing your emergency communication systems? It's really hard because even cell phones, they're expensive. If someone breaks their cell phone and it's a town or village or county owned, Bill, some of the officers break their cell phone. What do? Pretty much. Okay, I love this one. Do you have sufficient qualified personnel? Well, first of all, do you have sufficient personnel to start with? And most people in here are gonna say, we really do not have enough staff. And that's the hard part when you're trying to have your emergency operations center. So think about it this way, college, do you guys have enough staff to have a good EOC open? Taconic? Yes? Okay. Can you verify the personnel have the training that they need? There's a lot of different training, like I mentioned, FEMA has a lot of extra courses. Experience, everyone has a lot of different knowledge and experience and capabilities. So it's important to bring everyone into it. Performance, actually how people work under pressure, because I've been here 18 years and I find it very interesting. Some people work really well when lives are at stake and some people are a little bit more stressed and a little bit more dramatic. And we talked about when was the last exercise you participated in. Continuous improvement. It's also important to look back at whatever incident or whatever happened and try to learn from it. Because we all have lessons learned. I do lessons learned for a lot of my personal life as well as work life. Like I will ask people, that's why the evaluations of sheets are so important. Because I look at them and I say, what could I have done better? What could I have changed in this training session? And I will look at it and I will talk to them what their opinion is. Because no one's perfect. Otherwise we would all just be, everything would be hunky-dory in life. So the important thing is to continuously improve your plans, policies, procedures, your training. If you come up with training that you need or want, or exercises, things like that. That's why we always suggest to do an improvement plan afterwards. There's a lot of different resources, like if you go to the FEMA website for dealing with the National Incident Management System, ICS Resource System Center, and additional men's training. There's a lot of training available online. Okay, what are the senior officials' responsibilities when preparing for an incident? What websites? You can go on to FEMA for any type of class. They also have classes in the Emergency Management Institute, which is in Emmitsburg, Maryland. They're a week long. I used to go to them all the time, but I think they started doing them again after COVID. But a lot of them are virtual, and to me, I love taking classes virtual, other than you get distracted and the phone rings, and then you're answering emails, but sometimes just getting classes online is a positive, but there's positives and negatives to everything. We kind of went over that. So FEMA does have a lot of different classes. Does anyone have any questions or comments on this section? Guess what? We're at Unit 7, and it's not quite 11 o'clock yet. I was hoping you guys didn't wanna stay till, we're supposed to be here till 10:30. Okay, but does anyone feel like I went too fast with anything? Course summary, terminology or objectives, summarize the course objectives. It's kind of like the first module, we talked about the course objectives, now we're talking about the course objectives again. Identify key discussion points, topics. Did we ever come up with the evaluation sheets?
Yes.
Okay, wanna hand them out to people?
Sure.
It might be great if they wanted to fill them out. See, I'm very helpful, I give them to you now so you can fill them out during the last module. Identify key discussion points. So, in module 2, we talked about the incident management system, the National Incident Management System, NIMS. And in module 3, we talked about the incident command system. A lot of people have already taken the class. Incident command system is a good class. It's available online. You can take incident command system 100 and 200 online. 300 is a classroom version. They're also coming back with incident command system 200 in classroom because they figured out that a lot of the times if you don't take it in classroom, it's harder to take 300. But it's also, when you think about it, anytime you can take a class with others, you learn from others. So I'm always a big believer in taking the classroom version as much as possible. Where are those online? FEMA, and then just Google independent study. Explain the attributes and purpose of an emergency operations center. There are a lot of different information. They have checklists and things of what you can put in your emergency operations center and how to set it up. But it's all based on what you need for the incident or what's needed. Explain the interconnectivity between the NAC group, EOCs, the Joint Information Center, and Incident Command. Incident Command is your boots on the ground. EOC, NAC group, Joint Information Center, everyone else is just supporting the boots on the ground. They're doing tactics, everything else is doing strategic decisions. So it's really important that you communicate because they need to know what's going on, you need a good situational awareness, and what resources that they need, personnel, supplies, equipment. Explain the senior official's role in preparedness. Preparedness is really just getting to know what you need to do during an emergency or disaster, thinking about the worst case scenario, developing all your policies, procedures, and things like that, and looking at your EOCs and developing checklists, depending on how you want to set up your emergency operations center. So thinking about preparedness, also thinking about what you have in your town, village, and county that you can use or would be willing to help out. It's interesting because a lot of the retail organizations are willing to help out during emergencies and disasters. And sometimes they'll, if you need a specific item, say, for example, cases of water. New York State has cases, which I mentioned, we actually have stockpiles, but you gotta drive like an hour to get it. Sometimes we can deliver, sometimes we can't, depending on what it is. But, look at what you have. Look at the resources you actually have in this county or the neighboring counties. Okay, congratulations everyone, you've completed the course. Thank you so much for your great participation, your great conversation. I think it really makes the course more important when everyone has a time to talk and give their opinions and everything. Please complete the course evaluation forms. Your comments are important, especially to me, because I learn from everything I do. Everything has positives and negatives, and I learn lessons learned. Thank you for your participation. Anyone have any questions or any thoughts or anything they want to go into? Okay, today has been a very stressful day, and I don't mind sharing it. Tom, you want to bring something up?
No, I just have a question for James Gussie. Okay, I'll give you a second.
Okay.
Okay, so on the last note, I will tell you that I have a personal emergency going on, so I want everyone to pray for my mother. She's on life support.
No.
So I'm sharing that with you because I want everyone to pray. If we all pray, then maybe it'll work.
It will work.
I'm hoping and praying. So,
I'm living proof.
Bill's been there and back.
awesome, that's what I like
I
to
had
do.
people-
So the light went the other way.
I saw,
Or they chase
I
them
walked
the other
the
way.
streets and had so many people say they prayed for me, that's unbelievable. And it worked.
Okay, so everyone just help me out a little bit, say a little prayer for my mom on your way home. And I think I did a pretty damn good teaching class considering the stress I'm under. Thank you. Because I wanted to prove that I'm strong enough to keep going, because, you know, it's not like you consider a hospital anymore. You can allow one person in a limited amount of time, and it's like, yes, gotta love COVID. So like I said, thank you all so much. And I hope this went well, it was a little over 2.5